Welcome, I'm Vincent, and in this episode, let's paint a set of Epic 40k ruins, the small kind from 3rd edition, 4 different ways, here at Bunker 6. So I'm going to be starting with some grey primer, but you can use black if you prefer. And the first style that we're going to be working on is the marble finish, as you can see here. The base coat that we're going to be using is Steel Legion Drab. This is a great brown mid-tone, so we can easily go darker from this point and lighter quite nicely. Now, of course, you can use an airbrush to do this step if you prefer. One of the most important steps throughout this entire video is going to be the dry brushing, so make sure that you don't have particularly much paint on your brush. As you can see here, I've been wiping it off, and then start brushing the paint on the top and stroking it downwards on the ruins. We're trying to really make sure that any highlight dry brushing is done towards the top of the ruins and leaving the bottom of the ruins kind of untouched. Now, the lighter these highlights get, generally speaking, you want to make sure that they're sitting on the higher parts of the ruins, and you want to make sure that there's less of it, so it's creating more of a contrast between the darker shades that you applied earlier. Now, the Seraphim Sepia wash has got 2 purposes. One is being used as a recess wash, and also to create darker contrast on the ruins itself. So we're going to make sure that we're pulling this wash down towards the base of the ruin. I just used a very subtle Rakarth flesh layer here just to bring down the yellow tones on the top of the ruin slightly. Once that all felt quite uniform, I then went in with a bright highlight of pale sand. The good thing about highlights is generally that's the first thing the eye notices, and it's a great way of making sure the model feels cohesive. And aside from just working on the edges, I'm also scraping it across the model to make sure that there's a bit more of transition between the surface and the corner of the ruins. Any areas that felt a little bit too extreme in the highlight department, I went in with Terminator Stone just to dull down those extreme highlights. Now I'm just using some pigment. Of course, you don't have to do this. I just dabbed it in a couple of places on the base to give it a bit more of a realistic feel. Now, the problem with doing a lot of these dry brush highlights is things can start to feel a bit washed out, so I went in with some watered down Seraphim Sepia one more time, just to give it a little bit more contrast to some of those crevices on the ruins. And as you can see, I'm starting with the brush at the top and then I'm pulling it downwards because, of course, the last place the paintbrush is generally where the most amount of paint will be left. And that's generally where the paint will be pooling. So we're going to be doing what we'd normally be doing in glazing as well, which is pulling the paint in the direction where we want it to be darkest. And as you can see, that Seraphim Sepia layer has created a nice transition. Now I'm going in with one final, very bright highlight of ivory, which is going to be just sitting at the tippy top of the ruins to create that final bit of contrast. And that is the marble ruin complete. Now let's move on to a sort of classic looking Epic 40k finish, which is the grey stone. Of course, if you look through some of the old White Dwarf publications, generally speaking, these ruins are a dark grey, which is what we're going to attempt here. My finish is going to be a little bit brighter than those that you'd find in those White Dwarf publications, but you get the idea nonetheless. We're going for a high contrast, dark grey to almost white finish. Now, the black was actually our base coat in this instance, and anything after that is going to be a dry brush highlight. Now, we wanted to make sure that we weren't sticking that grey in any of those crevices because the black is supposed to be doing the work of a shade in that instance, but any highlight that comes after this, we're going to be focusing in the upper half of the ruins to create the contrast. One thing to bear in mind is making sure that whatever dry brush you're using, there aren't any stray bristles, because sometimes they can create marks where you don't want them, where you have a chunk of paint on a random bristle that you didn't manage to scrape off, and then that leaves a big mark which you're going to have to somehow fix later on. One thing I like to do with these sort of grey buildings is add a slightly different tone. In some cases you can even use a blue wash, but I used a brown wash towards the base to give it the implications that it was actually seated in some dirt. Now, I wasn't just pulling this down towards the base, I was actually trying to add some of it to the side walls as well, just to make it look a bit more dirty. And of course we wanted to add a bit of that wash to some of the crevices as well. Now, this ivory highlight really made things start to pop, but of course tread lightly with this, because if you use too much you can start creating an unrealistic transition, which you don't want to go for. Of course, we want contrast, but we want it to be realistic contrast. And talking of realism, I like to use a multitude of different paints for the highlights sometimes, because it makes things seem a little bit more natural. If you're relying on one paint, sometimes it can be quite noticeable that there's just one paint doing the job. But if you can mix a couple of different paints together doing the same job but in different places, that finish can be a bit more realistic. Let's move on to the Sandstone Ruins. Now, I started off this particular mid-tone base coat with my brush, but I must admit that I ended up having to use an airbrush off camera because I was running the risk of the finish not being particularly flat. And of course, that is quite crucial when you're dealing with flat surfaces. So, this was finished with an airbrush, but if you are going to use a brush, just take your time and do those layers thin. Once you're happy with the finish of your mid-tone base coat, then you get to move on to the shade wash. This particular wash was mixed 50-50 with water because I didn't want to run the risk of adding too much shade too quickly. So sometimes just tread lightly so you don't make too much of a mess. And if you are going to take the watered down layer approach, make sure that each layer is dry first before you add an additional layer because you can tear the previous layer quite easily otherwise. The good thing about the Vallejo range is you actually have a series of paints that literally say sand in their name, from dark sand to pale sand. And I think that takes a lot of the stress out of trying to figure out how to do something as awkward as a sandy desert paint job sometimes. And these Vallejo paints do a really good job of complementing each other and making this job much easier, in my opinion. Now, I'm applying this quite liberally because I wanted the finish to be less yellow. That's why we're going with a much more sandy, chalky finish, as it were. But if you wanted to keep things more yellow, just apply less of the highlights. Now we're going to be hitting the ruins with some Praxetti white. One thing to be careful of is making sure that the previous layer is as even and as much of it is added as you possibly want to add before you start adding any additional highlights. Because if you didn't get things right on the previous layer, adding an additional highlight will make things worse. You want to make sure that that contrast looks even and consistent from the bottom to the top of the ruins, and sometimes if you're not getting those layers correct, things can look disproportionate and unrealistic. Now let's head away from terra firma and move over to Mars, of course, where our good friends the Adeptus Mechanicus like to hang out. So of course Mars is all orange and reds, and that's exactly what we're going to be applying here. But first we're going to start with our darkest tone, which is Rhinox hide. It's a very, very dark chocolatey brown, and it's going to be a great starting point for us to basically do any dry brush highlights up from. One thing to be careful of when it comes to these browns is making sure that you don't use earthy browns. You want to make sure that the browns that you use almost have a mahogany tone to them, so browns which are being cut with reds and oranges, because if you start using earthy browns, things are not going to look Martian-like, as it were. Now, one thing that's not being picked up very well on this video is, of course, the pressure that I'm applying to the brush onto the model. Now, even though it looks like I'm vigorously swiping left and right with my brush, the brush sometimes is barely touching the model, and sometimes it's touching it a lot. The reason why pressure is so important when it comes to dry brushing is for a couple of reasons. One, of course, you don't want to be adding dry brush paint into crevices, which can easily happen if you're putting too much pressure on the brush. And additionally, paint pressure is very important when it comes to blending in this dry brush technique, because the heavier you are with the brush, generally, you're going to be covering more of the model. So, a rule of thumb is the lighter the paint is, the lighter your brush strokes probably need to be. And as you can see from this final highlight, I'm barely dabbing the top corners of the ruins with this Troll Slayer orange cut with Scrag brown. And then we're going to be finished. Here are all 4 finished ruins. Now, of course, there's 1,000,001 ways of doing these processes, but these were the ways that came to mind for me. As you can see, we've got a few different variations here that I think would pop quite nicely on the battlefield depending on what you're going for. Thank you so much for watching till the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something perhaps. Now something new on the Bunker 6 channel, I want to find some creators from my Bunker 6 Discord and give them some love here on the channel. So I want to do a shout out for Merlin Models and his wonderful Orc Stomper that you can see here. It's a lovely paint job and I hope it inspires you if you're painting some orcs yourself. But as always, until next time, I'm Vincent signing off from here at Bunker 6.